Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath. Bow wow. Coming back at you with another Archon's Armory. This is the second half of our double from this evening, and we are going over cannons and Imperial artillery. This one will be a little bit shorter, as many of the items that we will be discussing are actually included in other videos, such as vehicle videos. But we'll be going over some basics and standards as far as it goes with Imperial artillery. Let us begin. The mythos. So, the first issue, and one of the ones that I really have a problem with certain 40k enthusiasts, is everything is huge. Now, I know the whole meme of everything in 40k is bigger, everything is a giant caliber, but really, you have to look at it this way. This game really came to be and got a lot of its lore from the 80s and 90s. Military technology has moved on from then, and even then in pop culture they were still 10 to 15 years behind the cutting edge. So, they thought things were big. I'm not going to say that things aren't big. There are plenty of large tanks. However, a lot of the guns that you see, look big in the art, look big on the models. They're not all that big in reality. It's a little bit adjusted for the fact that we know the caliber of certain weapons, and we can extrapolate it for others. So, I'll be using examples in this video, but first thing keep in mind, not everything is so gigantic, even heavy stuff. So, the second one is artillery is for the elite. Now, people see artillery as kind of synonymous with certain sections of the Imperial Guard, and of course, plenty of Imperial Guard regiments get access to artillery of different types during their campaigns, but really, guns, howitzers, shell throwers, any type of cannon counts in this review. So we will be talking about all kinds of things, from the absolute bare minimum of something that a PDF or a planet might get their hands on for free, and then we will be talking about some of the much more expensive pieces that are on vehicles or that are used for Imperial Guard sieges. And sieges are one of those things that come into the everything is huge and artillery for the elite, because if I were to compare an Imperial Guard siege corps, say the Death Corps of Krieg, their oh-so-famous siege corps with their lines and lines of heavy artillery, to the far more standard and much more common artillery company or artillery regiment of the Imperial Guard, the difference is night and day. Krieg is bigger, it's more archaic, it's using different types of equipment, it's using much more linear warfare tactics almost, and trench warfare tactics, whereas the Imperial Guard tend to use artillery as spot support. They tend to use it pretty consistently to just support offensives, prepare defensive works, and harass the enemy. And this is whether it is tubed artillery or mobile artillery, both of which we will be discussing. And finally, the Hammer of the Emperor. This is that thing of, is everything in 40k tubed? Is it all so enormous that it has to be mounted? Or is there a bunch of self-propelled artillery going around everywhere? And I really have to put it like this. The Hammer of the Emperor comes in two forms. Indirect, which I would argue is probably the more common form, just because it is less cost effective to use, less cost effective in terms of human lives to use direct artillery and put theoretically expensive guns on the front line of a conflict. However, it is also more expensive in terms of shells to use indirect artillery as opposed to direct artillery. And indirect, by the way, is firing at a target that you cannot see at the full extent of a gun's range. We will not be getting into the nitty-gritty of these weapons in terms of range or distance or filler or anything like that. They may be focuses of further videos, and when that is the case, I will go in deeper. But for the moment, we are overviewing. So, let us continue on to reality. The reality of cannons in the Imperial Guard, and I have some lovely official and semi-official art here that I am so happy to show you, because they finally came out with a weapon that we would be recognizing as a howitzer, something that has really been absent from the Imperial Guard as of, when I got into the hobby, and I've been calling for a long time, and now they finally put it into the game, and it's actually not terrible. So, Artillery on the Imperial Guard battlefield, like I said, is a support option. It is something that you can get a company of, and while you are not a, artillery regiment per se, you could get a couple of guns, maybe a single stonk of artillery, 10 barrels, 10 tubes, 5 artillery support vehicles. And that really wouldn't be something that the Imperium begrudges you if you're a wealthy, or more importantly, a trustworthy and loyal regiment. For example, standard Cadian regiments will always have standalone artillery support, whether it is in the form of anti-aircraft guns, of basilisk support artillery, self-propelled guns, or even, some mechanized assistance for guns, like some centaurs and tauroxes hauling field guns. Not at all unusual for those more storied and loyal regiments. And of course, the truly multiple option regiments like Krieg and again Cadia, they can have huge amounts of resources and mixed arms tactics. Where that is not the case, you might be looking at having to get some mortars or some light field guns in place of the genuine earth shakers and demolisher cannons or Medusa siege guns. So, the second one is the more wavery gray area of cannons, and these are wall guns, short guns, field guns, and local designs. So, wall guns and short guns are really the most quote-unquote cannon examples we have. For example, Imperial hives will often be described as having extensive networks of field artillery guns, referred to as wall guns, built into the hive wall, whether it's at the top or generally it's in armored portcullises on the wall itself or within a lower level of the wall. These hive wall defenses range from being very large, almost orbital, suborbital weapons like a laser battery or something like that that's designed to deal with, vessels in the local area, a flex gun or something like that, to really what we would consider an earth shaker with about 50% of its barrel shaved off or even more, some sort of short howitzer that doesn't need to have the enormous long range of Imperial heavy artillery, but does need to carry the amount of destructive power to blow apart what could be a siege sitting on their doorstep. That's one of the things with wall guns that I think needs to be emphasized. Walls are not just meant to protect an inner part of the hive. They're also a place from which you can reduce the amount of cover that your opponent has. So you don't want them being able to sneak up on the wall and sap it from the internal of an urban area. You want to have wall guns that can simply obliterate all of the buildings nearby, and if that means bringing down a HAB structure, which is a few hundred tons of reinforced permacrete and steel, the wall gun is going to need to be a considerable size larger than a 75mm field piece. Now, wall guns can be many different things. I generally view them as anywhere between a 100mm howitzer, 120mm howitzer or long gun, or short gun rather, because, wall guns can't be too big, or shortened versions of Imperial artillery. The most common example being the Earthshaker. Now, the Bombast field gun, which is the actual model that exists of this, I would consider on the 100 to 120mm howitzer side of things. And, based on the model itself, you could even argue that it's a 75mm gun, something very small or medium. But the short gun that I refer to is really an Earthshaker that has had most of its barrel length shaved down, like these Krieg cannons here, just a little bit sized up. So the Earthshaker's regular range or assisted range of 15 kilometers or so, or 25 kilometers or so, depending on which version you're using and what ammo you're using, it's going to be cut down to maybe 5, maybe 10. And the thing is, short guns and wall guns don't need to fire more than a couple kilometers. They're not expected to hit targets way outside of the hive's walls, and certainly not too far outside of the hive's shields. They are meant to protect the wall that they are part of, or mounted on. Finally, field guns and local designs. Field guns really are like the Bombast. They're like a support weapon, just a little bit heavier. They're for regiments that need to have on-call support artillery, but don't really have the legacy or the respect yet to start to use whole, mini companies of support artillery. They might have, a small field Cardra, 5 or 6 tubes.
10 tubes if they're, willing to drop some real money on it if they want to use it a lot. This would really just be considered a support asset and would generally be overlooked in the Imperial Guard system because 10 tubes of subpar local design or field gun artillery is going to be outclassed by literally any other Imperial Guard regiment. So the fear of like, well, it's combined arms tactics, they can't use artillery and infantry at the same time, they're not really able to cover 10 companies of infantry with one half-strength, unit of subpar artillery. If it has a use, and it is not going to be a detriment if they turn traitor, it is most certainly going to be used by the Imperial Guard, and generally the Adeptus Administratum and the Munitorum will probably look the other way unless they view it as some sort of threat, in which case you should really just be questioning the regiment's loyalty. So, local designs is just local planets can produce guns. As usual, when it comes to local designs, it's not impossible to produce these things. We did it in a very short amount of time on Earth, with 1910s technology. Lots of industrial worlds have much better technology than that, on par with, post-industrial revolution, but pre-nuclear and silicon age. So, moving on. Weight, standards, and replacement. In general, the issue with artillery is that it has a lot of moving parts, and it has a lot of need for replacement. This is one of the big issues with producing it locally, is producing spare barrels, producing spare ammunition, extra cogs, gears, aiming equipment, all of that is going to be an issue, and so that's another reason to keep the number of tubes down and to keep the compatibility between guns as high as possible. So if you have artillery like this, miscellaneous support guns, or if you're a PDF and you just have, random support artillery that you've taken off the wall or you've gotten from the Munitorum or bought from a Forge World, you will want to keep them all the same caliber, all the same parts, or you'll want to keep it very clear, like, this is the pieces for these guns, this is the pieces for these guns, we have lots of backups and, spare parts, but the Imperial Guard doesn't want to do this because it takes up time and effort on manufacturing ships and support vessels to ship in parts or ammunition from other worlds, so you'd want to use things like, the standard 120 millimeter round from the battle cannon also fits in our local designed field gun. Great, 100%. We might be wasting a ton of, powder by firing a tank shell out of what is essentially a howitzer, but if it works, it works. And, it's high explosive, it's pretty cheap. Do it. Finally, training and armament. Obviously, training with artillery is much harder than training with a standard infantry weapon or even a standard heavy weapon. And it does take a lot more time, and thus this tends to be a weapon of the Imperial Guard more than the PDF, and when it is in the hands of Chaos, it tends to be used rather poorly, even when it's wall guns or something very simple, or short guns or field guns, even when it's that lower technology level where you would expect them to get a bit more of a grasp of it, Chaos has never really employed field artillery, unless it was en masse to defend a place where the artillery is being produced. The best example of this that I can think of is the Shattuck. The Shattuck had a super heavy artillery piece, but apart from the Shattuck, who were already in a World War I style war, the folks on Fortis Binary and the fighting on Fortis Binary, which produced a lot of field artillery and ammunition, they were setting up artillery ambushes where, because they weren't super accurate and didn't have a lot of communication devices to get information back and forth from the front lines, they were organizing little traps where units would retreat, and then they would set up booby traps that would tell the artillery when to plaster their previous area of engagement. And they would just have, 65, 70 tubes of artillery aimed at every little unit grid, and then paste entire areas when the Imperial Guard came through. So that would be the best example of, guard level tactics being used with Chaos artillery. So, pros and cons of the cannon. I put of the, because it's just of all cannons or of artillery. In general, con, slow rate of fire. Most of these are going to be reloaded by hand, and even with assistive devices, some of the really bigger ones are absolutely unreasonable to expect somebody to be able to move and load on their own, which is why, internal crane mechanisms and, more realistically, servitor assistance is going to be pretty common. High explosive versus direct action round. So, high explosive is the most common round in the Imperium in general for cannons. This is both because they're generally used in the indirect fire role, and also because armor-piercing weapons exist, which are going to be better than the standard kinetic ones available. Uh, there's, yeah, we'll go over some of the effects of direct action rounds in a second. But in general, most of it's going to be high explosive, and they're going to have a smaller percentage of anti-tank rounds, even in tanks that are expected to see enemy combat. But most guns do have the option to have direct action rounds. So even like a Medusa siege cannon might have a specialty AT round, or an anti-concrete round, or an anti bunker round, which you could theoretically use to hit a vehicle. And in that direct action role, you're often going to see you're often going to see tank crews or gun crews decide to just hit under the target and try and flip it or damage the tracks or blow up whatever is threatening them. This doesn't work with certain vehicles, but it definitely works with smaller, lighter, or even some medium vehicles, depending upon the caliber. Direct and indirect sighting. So this can be a disadvantage for some guns. A lot of the artillery in 40k is relatively crude compared to modern guided rounds like Excalibur rounds and things like that, or assisted range rocket rounds like Urka. Some better guns do actually have assisted range, but that's generally to get what would be a very short range round into slightly more acceptable ranges. So guns that would only fire half a kilometer or a few thousand meters. The assisted range of a rocket round will get them firing to a kilometer, so they can hit a little bit further. But with real artillery like the 132, the Earthshaker, its rocket assisted rounds do assist it quite a bit. And of course, 40k, some of the sighting systems are good, some are quite frankly manual, and they're not very great at all. But it's going to depend on whether you're in a vehicle or you're using a field gun. In general, if you're using a ground-sighted cannon, like an Earthshaker that doesn't have anything except for a split trail and there's no vehicle attached to it, the sighting system is going to be manual, and you're probably going to want a fire director who has some decent cogitation or something mechanical helping him figure out where every gun should be aiming, which is often the case in regiments. It's not always the case with other forces that might not have that complex of a artillery support system. Weight and complexity. These guns are big. They're complicated, especially the vehicle ones are unbelievably complicated in terms of fitting a very large shell into this, medium to large vehicle. The Leman Russ, some of the cannons that fit in the Leman Russ just make no sense, and they would not fit. And then there's ones that are, well, of course that does fit, but how do you load it and fit like a commander in there? How does a gunner sit? I have here the Demolisher because it's a prime example of somehow rounds are getting into that breach. I couldn't tell you how. I'm sure there's some system, and whatever system that is, it is fairly complicated or fairly heavy. So either way, that's going to be a con. Built to purpose or custom built. Most artillery has a reason to exist. There are a couple of general all-rounders, and I would definitely call the Earthshaker the best example of quote-unquote Imperial standard artillery, because cut off half the barrel, you get a shotgun. Use the extended rounds, you get long-range artillery. Fire it over and over and over again, it's reliable, you can replace barrels, replace sleeves, it's got gears, it's pretty accurate. Its rate of fire is more than acceptable. And it has all different types of rounds. It has anti-aircraft rounds, probably, or sorry, it can be fitted for anti-aircraft duty. It can be fitted for anti-tank duty. It can actually have anti-tank weapons on it, or anti-tank rounds on it. The Basilisk itself can actually carry other weapons. There are various other types of self-propelled artillery, like the Usurper. Usurper's great, by the way. It's another version of the Basilisk that's kind of built on a well-protected chassis. And is designed to have the entire gun be internal rather than being half open. And a lot of these guns, especially the ones that are closer to wall guns or closer to like PDF equivalent, they are going to be custom built. So they're going to have chassis that fit into wall sconces. They're going to have lighter or heavier pulling things so that you can hook them up to local vehicles. But in general, the trains, the trails, to some degree the ammunition can all be modified. It's not like certain other weapons where modification is totally impossible or it's really really difficult or like there's only some set modifications. Artillery absolutely can have some modification as long as it's not like stuck inside of a vehicle. That's the one situation where it's going to be like, okay, well now we need to redesign the whole darn thing because it's not going to work anymore. And the last one, effects on armor. So this is controversial. It is a question of what does high explosive do to certain enemies. Now, in tank-on-tank engagements, firing high explosive is generally frowned upon because it's assumed that it just won't do anything. And in no conflict in real life is that the case as long as you're firing high enough capacity, high explosive rounds. So, what do I mean by that? A vehicle that gets knocked out doesn't have to be destroyed necessarily. It just has to have the crew think that they can't fight anymore. That could be the weapons get damaged, the turret ring gets damaged, any of the tracks, the engine overheats, anything like that. And all of those are kind of external factors that can be affected by high explosive. Not even saying that high explosive is the only option, but if I was in a Lehman Russ, I have my 120 millimeter, I have the ability to switch to an armor piercing round. But if I'm in a line of artillery and I see a lone enemy tank rolling up the line, I'm not just gonna run. There's a pretty solid chance that I can train on that tank and just delete it from existence or rip its barrel off, shatter its frontal armor with high explosive, cause a bunch of spalling. Because a lot of the armor in 40k is made out of plasteel, which acts similarly to our modern rolled homogeneous armor, but is, just more ductile and to a degree just a little bit more flexible in terms of how it can be casted, you're still going to get spalling on the interior of the tank. Not to mention breaking a lot of the things that are in the tank and possibly harming the crew with overpressure. So this is just one thing of like firing high explosive isn't just useless. There are armor piercing rounds for a lot of these cannons, but even if you had to rely on pure high explosive, you could hit a vehicle enough times, a vehicle, it wouldn't work as well on a whole like column of armored vehicles, but a vehicle, and you could pretty effectively damage it if you hit it enough times and well enough. Now the other thing is, do Marines hate artillery? Why is that in quotes? Because it's kind of a question. Marines are generally shown to be quite durable. They don't care much about battle shock. They don't tend to worry much about overpressure, even if they like drop into space. Like, it'll hurt them, and they'll feel uncomfortable, and their armor seals will go in, and they'll like get rigid and stuff because space, ice, etc. But they can operate in 0G. Are they affected by the shock of artillery rounds? Can they get buffeted? Do they get hurt by shrapnel? I would argue absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Not only would the evidence that I bring to this be the fact that high explosive can damage armor, and ceramite is most effective at absorbing energy threats and not kinetic threats. They are fully protected, yes, but shrapnel and direct artillery engagement is absolutely what the Imperial Guard Doctrine says to do when fighting Chaos Space Marines. So, if Imperial Guard Doctrine says to call upon heavy artillery, or, heavy armor, etc., essentially to call on cannons to deal with Space Marines, it would be entirely logical, then, that Space Marines would be vulnerable to concentrated artillery bombardment. And yes, they're quick. Yes, they're, very capable of getting out of the way of artillery. If you get directed artillery to follow a squad of Space Marines, or a unit of Space Marines, or a Space Marine vehicle column, if you got some big guns on order, you can absolutely break up the momentum of their attack, and break up the direction of their attack. So if they're coming in run one way and they're trying to absolutely blitz through one area, because that's what Marines are for, they're shock troops, if you can crack their central focus, if you could break off the tip of the spear, essentially, you could trap some of them in some areas, you can start getting units around them as they're pinned down, and while it might not kill them, you're gonna get pieces of cracked armor that become weak points. You're going to get damaged systems, confused auspex, blood loss, injury, shrapnel wounds, weapons disappearing, Marines half buried in liquefied dirt from the explosion. The other great one is collapsing buildings on Space Marines. A very useful tactic when you're dealing with Marines in an urban setting is delete the buildings they're using for cover. That requires pretty concentrated artillery, but for a set of wall guns, that's not an impossible task whatsoever. So that's just my take on the effects on armor. Do Marines hate artillery? I would say yes. So, standards and the long list of calibers. You'll notice, no pictures on this one. We just reading. Now, a vast majority of artillery is made by forges, including its ammunition, but the fun thing is, because it is so simple and because it's just a basic gun, a majority of that ammunition and the spare parts are made by Mechanicus-like fabrication vessels. These are not uncommon. They go along with large deployments of Imperial Guard. They're about the size of a cruiser, roughly. They're armed, not to the same exact standard, but they're essentially stuffed inside with a whole bunch of raw metal, a whole bunch of chemicals, and a bunch of kind of automation servitors and machines. In this ship, in this kind of airborne production forge, there is a system or a set of parameters that is set up, kind of a design or an engineering scheme that allows the forge ship to, get an order from the Imperial Guard. We need an extra 30 rounds of ammunition on top of what our local planet is giving us every week. And the mechanicals will be like, okay, cool. We're going to grab some high explosive putty from storage, some metal from storage, get out the design for the 132mm Earthshaker shell, and just go at it. And we're gonna make a small number of these. It's gonna augment your production. But where this really comes in handy is not, continually supplying them with ammo, though it does do that, and that also happens with power packs for las guns, is, oh, a gear broke on my gun and it's out of service now. Yes, we can basically just 3D print that shit. Not exactly 3D printing, but genuinely, like, we can CNC cut you a new gear and boom, put that gun back in service in like a few hours or even like a day or so if it's a big one. But the ability to do that is really what makes all of this artillery kind of circulate around the forge ship, because forge vessels are the ones supplying the Imperial Guard with all of these spare parts, all of the, like, fixes for barrels, maintaining guns, and, to a degree, extra ammunition. Now, while the guns themselves might be made elsewhere, obviously industrial worlds can absolutely make artillery, even to the forge standard, a majority of it is going to come from forges, and then be supplied and maintained by them. Licensed production, as I said, plenty of them come from other places, but generally the big ones, the ones with names in 40k, those come from forges. Innovation and degradation. So, on the side of bad, I say sights, and on the side of good, I say ammunition. So, the ammo for these guns is cheap. It's generally one piece, unless it's for super heavy guns. And it's good mix, mostly high explosive. The reason I say sights are generally worse is because the gun sights for the weapons themselves are worse. They're objectively something that came out of like the 30s. They don't really have any great fire direction equipment included with the gun itself. There's no digital relays or outlays. It's still cranking one direction, cranking the other direction, instead of having anything mechanical that helps you with this. What they do have, however, is a separate, a sight controller, a gun controller, where they'll be like, all right, all guns, 5 degrees left, 6 degrees up, add 5 pounds of explosive for the next one, go, shoot. So, centralized fire director, yes. Individual sights, no. And in areas where you don't have that centralized fire director, either because you're not supposed to be using those guns, or the Adeptus Administratum thinks that you shouldn't be using those guns, aka you're using them and, don't have a lot of support for them, you're gonna suffer from a lot of accuracy issues because your guns are essentially firing blind or with, some basic grid reference numbers, which are not perfect, and given how artillery works in the modern day, it's still not perfect with all of the systems and technology and the ability to get one-to-one feedback from the battlefield. That even with that, it's not perfect, and when you're firing without any of that, it's almost spray and pray. It's just a little bit better. So, listing off cannons, and I'm going to go real quick here because most of these are references. They're rough equivalencies to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I say this or that type of weapon. So, at the top, technically autocannons. 50mm Knight and primary tank autocannon, so that's a Lehman Russ autocannon tanks. 35 and 40mm, those are support or secondary autocannons, things that you're going to see in Sponsons or the coaxial guns on the Baneblade. 20 to 35, those are medium vehicle autocannons, so something like an armored car or a really light vehicle or almost an improvised vehicle might have an autocannon attached to it that's 20 or 35. Or if it's like a light secondary, like it's an APC, but it also has an autocannon. Wall guns and field guns, these are going to be in the higher end, so 75 is like the lowest standard. That's really like the base field gun that we used to have in our world, and basically things just went up from there. It lobs high explosive, it's very basic, they have pretty short range. 80 to 90 millimeters, those are like all the mobile guns. So 75 to 90, anything in there is going to be like, okay, you can tow it around the battlefield like the Bombast field gun, the one that they have a model for. That's going to be on the mobile guns list because it also does multi-roll. So a 75mm cannon, it can have armor piercing, it can have canister, it can have high explosive, it might even have heat because high explosive anti-tank or that little copper jet round does exist in 40k, as does Sabo, but we'll get to that in a second. Sabo and hyperdensity rounds, things that use diamantine and adamantium and depleted uranium. Or even some weird stuff like screw shells. That there's a thing like that for the Lehman Russ Vanquisher. It's confusing. I don't know how it works. But literally it screws through the armor. That exists. So those 75 to 90 range of the wall guns and field guns, that's going to be your multi-roll guns that are mobile. 100 to 120 field guns are more the walled artillery. They're going to be in stonks, a set of 10 to 20 howitzers. Of 100 to 120 millimeter grade. They're going to have much longer range than the direct mobile guns, and they're going to be fired in like a block. So, pick a grid reference number, everybody aims roughly around there, paste it. That's what you're going to get with field guns and wall artillery. But with wall artillery, obviously, you can see, like, okay, pre-planned target number 365 from our elevated position on the hive wall. That place is getting pasted. Smack it. So it could be a lot more accurate than just a basic field gun out in the middle of nowhere firing at something it doesn't have a reference for. Wall artillery could even have practice shots where they're like, let's load up a paint can into the 120mm gun and shoot and see what we can hit. Still on the wall artillery, but moving into slightly heavier stuff that might or might not end up in the hands of civilians. Like PDFs and local army, 132mm heavy wall guns or surplus guard field guns. So when I say surplus guard field guns, I mean the Earthshaker that's been cut down to fit into the civilian, it doesn't have to be fully military role. So it cuts the shell size a little bit, but in reality, it just chops the front half of the barrel off so that it fits in housings better. Theoretically, if you're making a self-propelled gun, this would allow you to make it even more efficient so that you can fit it into a smaller chassis. It's much lighter, but it absolutely kills its range and a lot of its velocity. So using it as an anti-tank weapon with relying on velocity instead of like a heat round or high explosive damage, it's going to be a little bit worse, but it is still 132mm gun. That is pretty good. And then the last ones would be anything 150 to 200mm. These are second line heavy guns, or what I would really consider super heavy guns if I was in the PDF. So these are any siege guns or miscellaneous super heavy cannons, something that my planet has held on to from back in the day. We have these, a traditional workshop that works with these big old guns, and, we don't use them for much. They kind of just sit around. We make a couple of them every now and then. We shoot them off for Emperor Day or whatever it is. Something celebratory that is clearly military in origin, but it could also include, decommissioned guns from the Imperial Guard, locally produced howitzers that are super archaic, like something along the lines of like the 152mm tube artillery of the Soviet Union, like these giant, unnecessarily sized howitzers that are just enormous and archaic, and they're big gun go boom. And those are really just going to be limited to planets that already had a tradition of having them. No one's going to pick that as their first option because they're heavy, they're hard to move around, they're much more expensive to make ammo for than a 100 or 120 millimeter gun, and quite frankly, they're overkill for 90% of the things that a PDF or a Hive is going to need. There are some situations where the Guard might use something really heavy like that, but it's beyond rare, and we're talking into the extreme siege regiments or the de facto artillery-only regiments. Moving in, we have tank variants. 105mm hypervelocity, or the Sisters gun, as I call it. So this is on the Sisters Predator conversion and on the Reaver light tank. This is a medium-barreled or medium-long-barreled gun that uses a very high pressure solid shot, or so it has two options basically: solid shot steel or high explosive round. They're smaller than the battle cannon. They have less penetration, but they have a lot of range. They can hit targets really far away. They can reload quicker than the 120 mil, and they can fit into vehicles that are much smaller than the Lehman Russ. So that's the 105 hype. I'll talk about it later when I talk about the Reaver light tank, and probably the Sisters tank as well if I get to that in however many years. The 120 millimeter battle and the 125 millimeter oppressor. These are really close to one another, and to be honest, given how new the oppressor is, I was almost convinced to just not include it, because the lore on it is very inconsistent. The gun itself looks smaller in caliber than the battle cannon. We know the battle cannon is 120 millimeter, which makes it very short, by the way. The 120 millimeter with its barrel length means that the battle cannon is firing almost a howitzer speed round. It's just a little bit faster. It's closer to a field gun in velocity, but it uses an absolutely enormous shell for a field gun, on a tank, and it can batter through armor. It's got AP, it's got tons of specialty rounds for it, almost like some of them are like programmable ammo. They're wild and weird. That weird drill round that I was talking about before, all of that, down to flaming inferno rounds for the battle cannon exist, but it isn't a super high velocity weapon like the 105 hype or the Vanquisher, which the Vanquisher is just a 120 millimeter, but extended with about twice the barrel and a bigger round. So it uses its absolute full kick to get the Vanquisher going faster. And the Vanquisher has sabot ammo, which means that it has a finned dart or a solid, small, hyperdense projectile that penetrates armor super well, but doesn't have a ton of explosive mass. I put the oppressor at 125 millimeters. I would also accept 90 millimeters or 95 for the oppressor, or even 100, because it looks thinner, it looks slimmer, it almost looks like the Patton gun from the Cold War, and the way that they describe it, it has a higher velocity and a longer barrel than the battle cannon, but it isn't a Vanquisher because the Vanquisher has too complex of a design to manufacture in large numbers. That doesn't make any sense to me, or at least the reason why the oppressor was chosen over just putting the Vanquisher in the new Dorn tank, I don't know. Maybe the oppressor's a new design, maybe it's an old design that just takes up a lot of space and looks very slender. In any case, it is essentially just a reskinned Vanquisher cannon that doesn't need to use specialty ammo to get the same level of armor penetration. Vis-a-vis, that's why I put it at 125 millimeters, just up a little better. It's better than the battle cannon at armor piercing, but it doesn't seem to be all that superior in terms of high explosive outside of the tabletop, which doesn't apply for this analysis. So the next one up is the 132 millimeter Basilisk or Earthshaker. This is what I would call the standard Imperial Guard gun. There are smaller ones, obviously mortars and that type of thing come into effect, along with, Imperial Guard units that use abnormal artillery, but the basic is 132 millimeter. It doesn't really have a real-life equivalent, at least not a perfect one. There's 128 millimeter naval guns, there are some 130 millimeter guns, but the Basilisk is pretty unique in that it is basically just a field gun. Basically just a howitzer. It's got recoil springs, it's got a pretty simplistic train, and it's just got a monstrous, like 9 meter long barrel. So the Basilisk spends tons of pressure getting it out, and it is designed to do all types of stuff. It has high velocity, it's got long range, it can fire armor piercing, high explosive, flak, it can fire all kinds of stuff, and it has lots of different platforms. And like I said, you can even cut it down and make a smaller gun out of it. So 132, absolutely awesome. The next ones are kind of estimates because we have no idea what the caliber of these are. I have collated a couple of them, but I will explain why in a bit. The Conqueror or the Medusa. So I put the Conqueror and the Medusa as roughly the same at 280 millimeters. They are very short guns. The Medusa is literally a siege gun that has a range of less than 5 kilometers. And matter of fact, I think it's considerably less than that. The Conqueror has an even lower range, which makes sense because the Medusa is said to have, some, not necessarily rocket-assisted projectiles, but some assistance or like bagged charges that it can add to it. And the Conqueror being inside of a tank, it would make sense that that isn't the case for it because you can't increase the amount of bags if you don't have a big enough breach, and the breach takes up space in the turret. The Conqueror cannon could also be 120 millimeters, just cut short, but then I really wouldn't see the point of it because the 120 millimeter battle cannon is already short in terms of calibers, so the Conqueror having the same explosive mass but a shorter barrel would make it absolutely redundant. And considering that it is kind of described as, oh, it's this high explosive lobber tank that, it can be used to crack defenses when you don't have artillery, it kind of lends me to being like, maybe it's a higher caliber, maybe 180, somewhere in there. I just put it equal with the Medusa because it looks similar, but it's pretty obvious that they're probably not the same caliber. Those ones are really questionable. It's not really cleared up. We know what the Medusa is, but we don't really know what the Conqueror is. The next one is the Demolisher. I put it at 360 as opposed to the Baneblade's 380 for its main gun, mainly because the barrel difference and because the Demolisher seems to fit in more things. 360 and 380 being close to the Sturm Tiger's actual gun, which is kind of what the Demolisher is based off of. It's a rocket-assisted shell that fires out of a tiny barrel. With the Demolisher, the Baneblade takes that whole idea of what if we had a super heavy shell that fires out of a thing. Where the Demolisher just has like Hesh and one anti-concrete round and high explosive, the Baneblade has armor-piercing shells that are 380 millimeters in size and are rocket-assisted out of a 10-meter-long barrel. The shells that come out of the Baneblade don't kill tanks. They flip them around like a coin that you're flipping into a water fountain. I would definitely see a high explosive round from the Baneblade disabling any tank that doesn't meet the level of super heavy. Genuinely, it is enough high explosive mass to collapse the front of most armored vehicles. And that's not even talking about the armor-piercing rounds, which it has. And they're pretty good. Honestly, I'd put the Baneblade up against most vehicles in 40k, even to the level of Knights. I genuinely think, because the most hilarious thing to me is that on this list, the Oppressor has claimed that it can kill Knights, and that's its claim to fame. And good luck to you. If you're a tank crew and you're fighting a Knight with that, good luck to you. I'm not knocking it, but I'm not saying you have a good chance, my friend. Unless that thing is brain dead and stupid, or there's like 30 of you. So yeah, good luck. But the Baneblade, however, Knights should fear your main gun. And I don't mean fear like, want to avoid getting... They shouldn't want to engage with you because you outrange them. That is insane to me. The Baneblade can, with its main gun, kill an enemy Knight before any of the Knight's main armament get into lethal range with the Baneblade. A wild concept, considering what is normally, tanks can just knights can just dance around tanks and shoot them to death, and they have all these great weapons. The Baneblade absolutely doesn't give a single flip about most knight weapons. Even the main guns of armor-piercing knights have a hard time penetrating Baneblade armor, and even if they do, the Baneblade has 3 decks and like 60 crew. You would need to destroy the weapon systems individually or melt the entire tank down, which will take a whole bunch of dancing and one misstep, and a 380mm Sabo, armor-piercing high explosive, heat, inferno, etc. round will rip right through your little ion shield and destroy your god machine. So I wouldn't come anywhere near a functional Baneblade unless it was alone or for some reason disabled. If I was a knight, I would be horrified of this gun because it can kill me so easily by landing even like a glancing shot. It will cripple me. So moving on from the fact that the Baneblade is incredible, these are the true estimates. These are the ones where there's absolutely no data and the clear definition of what the heck it is. No idea. Macro cannons, I put 1,000mm. That's just for the shell itself. So that's, 100 centimeters, a 10-meter round. One of the bigger guns to ever exist. I would say that's true for like smaller flex macro cannons. Obviously, ship-mounted macro cannons are going to be much bigger. They're, several dozen meters wide in terms of their shell, if not the actual bullet. But macro cannons that are mounted on, the top of a hive and can flex and fire at different targets and kind of like use the curvature of the earth to fire, those are not going to be as big as the ones on ships. And even the ones mounted that are like inflexible gimbals on ships or hanging off the top in like turrets, they're going to be smaller just for logistics sake. And I say 1,000mm is fairly reasonable, considering that they can fire, a couple rounds a minute, maybe 1 round every minute would be a little bit more reasonable. But still, the fact that macro cannons can fire with any amount of regularity is absolute insanity, and man, the gun decks of Imperial ships are awesome. But moving on. 100mm for the Knight Cannon. So, the Knight Kinetic Cannon, that kind of battle cannon that they describe, I put it as 100mm for the same reason as the Oppressor. It's definitely a Titan weapon. It's like a heavy tank-destroying grade weapon. But it is inefficient to have an enormous gun on a vehicle that can move around and is going to be equipped with the top-of-the-line armor-piercing capability. Again, the battle cannon has to swap to a specialty armor-piercing round to get through anything other than, like, slightly worse than its own armor. Again, the Lehman Russ armor-piercing round theoretically can penetrate its own frontal armor, but not with, not at range and not with a great amount of regularity. You shouldn't bet on it, which is why all the specialty AP rounds exist, because, Trader Lehman Russ tanks do exist. So the 100mm, I say that because putting a bigger gun on a Knight would, hamper it. It would be difficult for it to run. The other thing is the length of the cannon makes it pretty clear that it's relying on velocity. And the extra 20mm to make it a battle cannon size is literally just a waste, and it's going to cost more weight. So it seems more reasonable to me because the 100mm cannon with a big enough armor-piercing round, and of course, more importantly, the specialty ammo available to Knights, can absolutely overmatch standard tank armor and mess up Lehman Russ tanks, which it is shown to do many times. Put a big hole right through the center of the armor. I'm on board with that 100%. Titan cannons. So there's a couple of these. The main ones are the ones that basically look like an assault cannon, but they rotate. I don't even want to consider what that would do to anything in existence that managed to be anywhere near it. But considering each of those barrels looks like it can fit, I don't know, a yacht, I'm just going to be safe here and say it's about a 200mm shell per barrel, and it's fluted a little bit. So, this is a full estimate, but I'm being a little bit like, yeah, it should probably be double the size of the Knight one. maybe a little bit more. And then the last one is, you see this a lot, these big semi-automatic heavy cannons, or they call them autocannons, but that's really probably just because they're self-loading, or at least they have some sort of cassette, or sorry, not cassette, but, auto-loading system. The heavy Space Marine vehicles. There's quite a few of these. The main one that comes to mind is the Predator. I would put these at 90 millimeters because it's obvious that they are smaller than a battle cannon, but, also just a tiny bit smaller than the hypervelocity in the Sisters gun. In general, and while they do seem to rely on specialty ammunition, they do also have some decent velocity for a 90 millimeter cannon. So I'm on board with that being their kind of standard. Whew, that was long. Let's move on. So, variants and models. We have bigger tanks than you. Your argument is invalid. God, that is an ugly Baneblade. That frontal gun is terrible. But, ignoring the fact that I wish to correct this vehicle, self-propelled versus static, there are a ton of these. Generally, Chimera chassis are used to move around these guns. Static are ones that you're going to see in just a trail or a single chassis that is on a fixed wall or a mounting or dug into a position. On the civilian side, you'll have those cut-down guns, those more local designs, lower caliber in general, and they'll have less available specialty ammunition. Generally assume if it's something that's armor-piercing, like it's low enough to be like, ah yes, my 75mm gun also does dual roles as an anti-tank gun. It's just going to be a solid steel round. Usually, maybe it'll have some explosive in it, something like armor-piercing high explosive, but you're not going to get HVAP or APDS or any Sabo rounds. This is not going to happen in the civilian side of things. On military, you will get all that special ammo. Plus, it'll be available to you. It won't just be like, ah yes, my one single round of APHE for my entire stonk of artillery. It's going to be like, somebody pull out the AP rounds. I see heretics in armor over there. And you swap out. Military surplus and modification. So, while it is generally illegal to modify equipment, it does not mean that you can't get a little bit of wiggle room. And we know this. The entirety of the existence of the, not the Harkoni Warhawks. Oh my goodness, they use the Akatran Lasgun. Why am I'm losing my mind. That, Elysian Drop Troopers. The entire existence of the Elysian Drop Troopers own, personal variants of all of their weapons, from mortars to heavy bolters to their bayonets and their main guns. All of that is, private or, regiment-wide special modifications for them. I could see that being entirely possible for a regiment. Another one is the Talarn Desert Raiders do this all the time. Their artillery is all modded out with super nice camo. It's got weather nets. It's got specialty auspex set up for them to get triangulation on their target. All their basilisks are dripped out. And also, the Armageddon Steel Legion is another great example. Their self-propelled guns are hermetically sealed and protected from the elements. Another probably full-on modification applied to the whole force. So yeah, there you go. And military surplus is just what the guard stops using, or what the guard leave behind, or what you steal from them if you're the chaos side. That's how you get artillery. So, mountings, housing. Alright, really I'm going to ignore the mountings and housing because I've already been over it 5 times, but mortars, I'm not going to mention them very heavily because they're super basic. They exist on all sides of everything. And while, it can be hard to make high explosive compounds as a non-industrial world, an industrial world that had the ability to buy those things are also just totally capable of making their own mortars. I have no idea why anyone would think that a tube with effectively a spigot rocket is outside of the ability of a planet that regularly makes, full-on tanks with a little bit of coaxing. I don't see how that would be unreasonable for them. It definitely is something that they can make. And they generally fall into 2 categories. You're going to get little tiny baby 60mm mortars. Up to 80mm is yes, my squad infantry support gun is an 8cm mortar. And then on the other end, you're going to get the vehicle-toted or the kind of rocket-assisted. In some cases, they're just going to be straight up rocket tubes, like the Hwacha, or the Screaming Mimi, the little 360mm rockets. We'll talk about those later. Those are a different thing when it gets to crack missiles and things like that. But for mortars, You're going to get the light ones from 80 to 60, and the heavy ones from 90 millimeters up to like 180 millimeters. And those ones are going to be on vehicles. The heavy mortars, the Griffon like pattern mortars, those super heavy siege ones, those are going to be even bigger. But they're essentially just going to take the design of the Demolisher and turn it into a mortar somehow. Don't ask me how they did that. I have no idea. So, user's importance and logistics. Really quickly, just to give you an idea, the Baneblade gun is somewhere in the like range of the like 1943 naval gun over here. So the shells of that's just the shell, by the way, not the propellant, is almost the size of a human being. And a macro cannon shell is 20% larger than this, which makes it, I don't know, 2.5 times the size of a human being. And you can see over here, a lot of the rounds are finned. These are going to be those rocket-assisted shells, so like, Demolisher maybe, Conqueror maybe, and then these necked ones are going to be the 120 mil, the 135 mil, that kind of standard battle cannon rounds, and then even smaller than that is going to be the Earthshaker rounds, these kind of fat, flat, basic artillery shells, and then you get down to field guns, smaller field guns, wall guns, etc. And then obviously you have the specialty stuff and then autocannons down here. This is just a little chart I found. So, PDF, they're going to use the wall guns. They're going to use the local device guns, the howitzers, that kind of stuff. And there are, of course, as usual, going to be archaic versions of this. Black powder cannons are still used in some corners of the Imperium of Man. Not of much importance to us as fans, because, we're not fighting 18th century warfare here. We're fighting Tyranids. But it still exists, and where you're not going to get it, you're also going to get, hand-me-downs from the Guard, like those 132 millimeters that you sawed the barrels off and called them civilian guns. Chaos is going to get their hands on these in many different ways. Generally, they kind of use them and lose them because they don't hold on to ground as often. They kind of raid, grab equipment, bring it back, can't really supply it. I have this Earthshaker with 50 rounds, but there's a broken gear. How do we fix? Oh, we can't? Shoot. Well, I guess we gotta use it real quick then, or maybe I have to modify it. I have to, jerry-rig up something to make it work. A lot of the artillery in Chaos Forces is just gonna be like, where did this gun come from? It looks like it was captured 40 years ago. Yeah, it was captured 40 years ago. We also cut down the barrel, chopped off 3, all of the support system and mounted it onto this big old servitor, and we now use it as like a walking gun turret. Insane stuff just because logistics are against the Chaos side in 40k. So that's how you're going to get it. For the Guard, true Guard regiments that use only artillery do exist. These are artillery regiments. They're elite. They'll have the more special guns. But if you're a bog standard force and you don't have a lot of trust, you might end up using kind of a little squad or a little group of civilian derived guns, either locally produced or like, hey, Forge World, you have like a couple of 120 millimeter, shells or stonks we could use, like 10 of them, sure, yeah, we'll grab that, and they pay for it. And then if you are really trusted, you can probably get, a nice solid branch of like, here's 30 Earthshakers. Go nuts. Infantry unit, you need something taken out of the way, you have the artillery to do it now. Good job. Go get them. You're trusted. Do the Emperor's duty. And then on the other hand, you have artillery regiments, which are just going to be like, yes, here is my 37 fields of guns. Which guns would you like where? How about I just absolutely don't engage with the enemy and plaster them whenever I feel like it? AKA, artillery regiments have the easiest job in the Imperium, until they get overrun and completely obliterated, as they deserve, cowards. So, other forces that use artillery. There are plenty of them. Generally, civilians don't get their hands on this, like actual civilians, like gangsters and stuff like that. But orcs have used artillery before. The Mechanicus have their artillery. One of the big things with artillery is also like, there's super big standout examples of like the Ordinatus level weaponry. That stuff that is, kind of apocalyptic, or it belongs on ships only, the Nova cannons, the crazy stuff like that. All of that is kind of irrelevant to this discussion because we're just talking cannons here, and that's the basics of what is available in the 41st millennium. So much of that other stuff is just going to be relegated to when we do specific talk on other forces. Alright, so there's your second one. I was planning on this, so I'm on cannons now. I'm gonna move on. I'm not sure exactly what I'm gonna do for my next one. I do have one on high energy laser weapons planned out, but I want to see how these two go first. I might wait a couple days. Y'all comment, like, subscribe away. I would love to make this a consistent series and keep doing it for y'all. And I wish you all a lovely evening and good night.